Chapter 10, Monetary Policy and Aggregate Demand. So in this chapter, we're going to learn two new important concepts. The number one being aggregate demand and how it is used by the Federal Reserve, the central bank, to influence the monetary policy. We have learned the IS curve already so far, the investment saving curve, which basically says as interest rate R reduces, meaning the cost of borrowing reduces, output Y increases. Think about it. Just this is a revision from previous chapters. As you can borrow money cheaply, real interest rate R reduces from 2% to 1%. Output goes from $9 trillion to $10 trillion. More people can borrow, they'll invest in building better machines, better factories, and they'll produce more. So that is the IS curve that we've already looked at in the previous chapter. In this chapter, we're going to learn two new curves. The MP curve, and when we combine the MP curve, which is the monetary policy curve, combine the MP curve with the IS curve, we can build the AD curve, which is the aggregate demand curve. So remember, this is the basis. If you've not seen the previous chapters, you should probably figure out to what the IS curve is. You're going to build on this. Every chapter builds on the basis. If you are directly coming to this chapter, a lot of things will go over the head. So go previous chapters, make sure you understand the IS curve. Okay, we understand the IS curve. Now let's look at the MP curve, which is the monetary policy curve. Monetary policy curve is interest rate and inflation. Remember, it's different. Interest rate and output. Here it is interest rate and inflation. What it says is that as inflation goes up, interest rates rise. At 2% inflation, interest rate was 1%. At 4%, interest rate became 2%. Right? So interest rate went up when inflation goes up. So how does this, is this really true? Why not? Why not go down, right? Why not when inflation goes up, that interest rate goes down? Let's look at that example. If inflation were to go up, and let's say the Federal Reserve didn't do anything, right? If the Federal Reserve didn't do anything, then the nominal interest rate will go down. The equation, remember, for interest rate I, nominal interest rate I equals R plus pi, which is inflation. So nominal interest rate is equal to real interest rate R plus inflation pi. So if this is the equation in which how interest rates, nominal interest rate and real interest rate are connected with inflation, and to back off a little again, is Federal Reserve sets this variable I. When the central bank sets the interest rate, they'll set I. And that will have an impact on R, which is the real interest rate. And inflation is not something that the Federal Reserve can control in the long run, but in the short run they can. So let's look at it. So we were going back again like, hey, why is this curve up and not down? So let's imagine inflation is going up. Things are getting more and more expensive for us to buy. And let's say if the Federal Reserve reduce the nominal interest rate I, and so then what will happen? R will also go down because of this equation. And so when real interest rate goes down, we know when real interest rate goes down, output goes up. So then output will go up. When output goes up, inflation will go up. So an increase in inflation leads to an increase in output, which leads to increase in inflation, increase in output. So this will be a vicious circle. If the Federal Reserve were to decrease the interest rate And that's why it's not going down, because if inflation was going up and if interest rates were going down, then that's what this thing would entail. It will be a vicious loop in which the inflation will get out of control. Output will keep going up. Now, when inflation goes up, what Federal Reserve generally does is that they increase the nominal interest rate. When they increase the nominal interest rate, R balances out. Initially, R will have an impact because in the short term, the real rate will change. But eventually, in the long run, R will balance out and the output will balance out. So this stabilizes the loop. The intervention of the monetary policy, this is the monetary policy in action. The Federal Reserve increased the interest rate, both the nominal, which impacts the real when inflation goes up. So that's the key takeaway. And let's take another example just to make this thing really clear. So let's say today inflation is 7%. Every year inflation is, cost of goods is increasing 7%. And then let's say the real interest rate is 2% and nominal interest rate, which is pi plus r equals 9%, right? So let's say this is what is today. And then let's say the inflation increases. Let's say things become expensive for whatever reason. It goes from 7 to 8%. If the Federal Reserve didn't do anything, because of this equation, I equals r plus pi, r will remain the same, I will increase, right? Because pi went up. So the nominal interest rate becomes 10%. You see how? Inflation increases interest rate automatically. Now, what the Federal Reserve does is that, hey, it doesn't want this to be a vicious loop. So then it says, hey, I'm going to set this to 9%. I'm not going to make it go to 10%. So it still keeps the interest rate low at 9%. And then what happens is that has an immediate impact on, because the total has to be 9. Given inflation is at 8, then this will adjust immediately to 1, the real interest rate. So then the total becomes 9. So we saw when the Federal Reserve did an action to keep the interest rate low at 9%, when it should be 10, it reduced the real interest rate from 2 to 1. And this happens because in the short run, prices are sticky, right? So inflation prices, you can't really control them. So this will remain the same, but the cost of borrowing, real cost of borrowing went down because the Federal Reserve came in and said, hey, I'm not going to increase my interest rate. And so, but in the long run, what happens is that prices are flexible. As these people start borrowing at cheap money, they can produce more goods. And so what happens then is that it adjusts back up to 2% because inflation would have gone down from 8 to 7. So you see what happened? Federal Reserve acted on I, that had an immediate impact on R, and that had a long-term impact on pi inflation. So reducing I reduced the inflation. So it's the same situation as we saw here. As I goes up, pi goes up. I goes down, pi goes down, right? So I and R are similar because they are interest rates. So we saw this piece, right? So that's why it's an upward curve. It's an upward curve because of this example that we saw. So inflation and interest rate, they have a direct impact, like they are directly related. If one goes up, the second goes up. So now we know, and that is called the MP curve, the monetary policy curve, right? So we now also know why it's upward sloping, because we saw how if it was not, then it would have been a vicious cycle. And we also saw that you can impact this in the short run, you can change the inflation, but in the long run, prices are flexible, and in the long run, only how much your country saves, how much your company saves, how much your company invests back, that has the best way to control inflation in the long run. The short run, you can do this, right? So now we've built the MP curve. We already went over the IS curve, investment saving curve, monetary policy curve. With these two, we can build the aggregate demand curve, the AD curve. This is the AD curve. So what is this AD curve? AD curve is inflation and output, the relationship between inflation and output. As inflation goes down, output goes up. And if you were to think about this, if you combine these two graphs, you get this graph. Think about this, right? So this one shows relationship between inflation and interest rate, right? This graph shows relationship between interest rate and output. So A related to B and B related to C. So you can go A related to C, right? Similarly. So pi related to R, R related to Y, so pi related to Y, right? That's what this is, pi related to Y. So if you see this transitive nature, you can build this. You can build this AD curve, which basically shows what is the aggregate demand curve. So it's also downward sloping. At higher inflation, the output is low. At lower inflation, output is high. And that also follows our intuition. As people, and during lower inflation, you can borrow. During lower inflation, the interest rate is low. So people borrow. And when people borrow and invest in building factories that can produce, they can produce more. So if you reduce taxes, again, the output goes up. If you reduce the friction, financial friction that we've seen in the previous, the output goes up. Government purchases goes up, the output goes up. So we now connected the monetary policy curve, the IS curve, and built the aggregate demand curve. But in monetary policy, there are two things that happen. There's monetary tightening and there's monetary easing. So let's say this was the MP curve, and then now let's say if we build this curve. Right? So if this line were to shift up versus shift down, so if the MP curve shifts up, what happens? Let's take a look. So at the same 2% inflation, if we get interest rate to be 0.5%, right? So this one would be monetary easing, right? Because you've eased the interest rate from 1% to 0.5%. You've reduced the interest rate, so it's easy to borrow money. So so yeah, this is easing and this is tightening. So here, when monetary tightening happens, the interest rate goes up, right? For the same inflation target, the interest rate went up from 1% to 2%, but for monetary easing, for the same inflation, went down, the interest rate went down from 1% to 0.5%. So monetary actions, the government, the central bank can come in and say, hey, I want to tighten the money supply, meaning I will increase the interest rate, or I want to loosen the money supply, I'll reduce I'll reduce the interest rate. That has a direct impact on the output, right? We just saw that. As interest rate goes up, inflation goes up. As inflation goes up, output goes down, right? Output goes down. So the central bank has a huge power, and they look at inflation to adjust the output so that the output is at the optimum level. So if they feel it's overheating, they will raise the interest rate so that the monetary supply will become harder. The supply will be drained. The money supply will be drained, and so then what happens is the output reduces. But if they feel the economy is not even at its potential, then it will reduce. It will have monetary easing. It will have lower interest rate. Lower interest rate will lead to higher output. So that's how monetary policies, in terms of whether it is tightening or easing, impacts the aggregate output. Right? But that's not the only thing that the Federal Reserve looks into, not just inflation. It looks into various other things. And so for that, we need to develop this theory that use this theory by John Bernard Keynes. It's liquidity preference framework or function, where basically it says that the money demanded, what is the money demanded, depends on the price level. Money demanded for a given price level is related to inflation and output, inverse relationship with a minus with inflation, and direct relationship with output. So money demand and inflation have an inverse relationship. Money demand and output has a direct relationship. So think about this, right? So when the Federal Reserve has to set an interest rate, it looks at these variables. It looks at like what interest rate I should set depends on what is the money demanded in the system and what are the price level. Price level is nothing but inflation. So for any given price level, there will be a demand for money. Price level is nothing but inflation. So money demanded at a given price level depends on the interest rate and output. Intuitively, think about this. If the interest rate is low, then you don't want to give the money to the bank. You'd want to keep more money, so money demand goes up. But if the interest rate is high, then money demand goes down, because you can just give that money. You don't need that money. You can keep it with the bank and they'll give you more interest. So the money demand goes up. So that's why there's an inverse relationship. And same with output. The money demand goes up, output goes up. Money demand goes down, output goes down. So liquidity preference function tells us how the Federal Reserve would be setting the interest rate. So let's look at a few more examples to understand how the monetary policy functions. The first one, we need to build this two new concept called aggregate money supply and aggregate money demand. We'll build on top of the liquidity preference framework. So here, money demand is a downward sloping curve. And what's the intuition behind it? So for any given interest rate, when interest rate goes down, the money demand goes up, right? We saw that here, and we also know that intuitively that if I'm not getting enough interest from putting that money in the Federal Reserve, I'm going to keep it and use it. So as interest rate goes down, money demand goes up, right? So money demand is a downward sloping curve. And money supply is fixed. Like, let's say this is the total money in the system. The Federal Reserve has issued certain amount of money, so that will be fixed. So money supply is fixed. When you are here, your money demanded is M1, but the money supply is MS. So money supply is greater than money demanded. So there's more people willing to, take that interest rate. It's easy to get that high level interest. And so what happens is that the interest rate falls because there's excess supply of money here. And eventually it goes to this equilibrium point here. At the same time, when you are here, when the money demand M3 is greater than MS, the money supply, this is MS over P equals M2 over P. When you're here, basically you're saying, hey, I need more money than what's available in the market. And so then you're willing to pay more interest rate. So then the interest rate goes up, right? This converges here. So this is the equilibrium point. So money supply and money demand they try to meet at the equilibrium, because the interest rate either falls when there is excess supply of money, or it increases, interest rate increases when there is excess demand for money. So once we understand that for a given level of money is demand, M1, M2, or M3, for a given price level, it tries to reach the equilibrium. And so this equilibrium changes. When does this equilibrium change? So let's say the income changes. Let's say the country makes more money. So then what happens? The demand for money goes up. People want to spend more money when they're making more money. So then they'll demand more money. So when the money demand goes up and the supply remains the same, interest rate goes up, right? It goes up from here to here. The demand curve shifted, right? Supply remains same, interest rate goes up. Typically what the Federal Reserve will do, if it doesn't want the interest rate to go up, it will also increase the supply. So when you increase the supply, and if you, let's say, go here, then the interest rate remains the same, right? Similarly, so that money supply, if it remains same, then the income increases interest rate. So that's another factor that changes the interest rate, right? Second thing that changes the interest rate is the total money supply. So if, let's say, the money supply went up from MS1 to MS2, the interest rate falls. This is excess money. We saw this here, right? From I3 to I3 to I2. So when money supply changes, when Federal Reserve pumps more money, the interest rate would fall. Similarly, when the prices, the inflation goes up, when the price level goes up, from P1 to P2, when P2 is greater than P1, even though it's shown here because it's the division of money supply over P1. So when P2 is greater than P1, MS over P2 is less than MS over P1. So then what happens is the money supply goes to the left, right? Because the price level went up. When the price level goes up, interest rate goes up. So we just saw how inflation has an impact on the interest rate through the MP curve. But we also saw how income increase leads to an increase in interest rate. Money supply decrease leads to an increase in interest rate. Price level increase leads to an increase in interest rate, right? So there are so many such factors that lead to the Federal Reserve setting the interest rate. And that changes the MP curve, it changes the output. And so the Federal Reserve has to look through all of this when they make a decision. And we already saw how the income savings IS curve, investment savings curve shifts, right? It shifts when investment saving curve shifts, the aggregate demand curve shifts. The income investment saving curve shifts when you increase your consumption, when you have more investments expenditure, when the government purchases, reduces taxes, reduces friction, and increases exports. That we know changes the investment saving curve, and the investment saving curve directly changes the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so in a sense, we learned two new concepts. One is, how did we get to building two new curves, the MP curve? We already knew the IS curve, we built the MP curve. Combining the MP curve with the IS curve, we got the AD curve, which is the aggregate demand curve. And we now know from the demand and supply curve of money, we can build theories as to when interest rate changes based on income, money supply, price level, inflation. Great. So we just connected these through, right? So we knew the IS curve, increase in interest rate reduces output. We also connected that to the MP curve, increase in inflation, increase in interest rate. And then we combine these two to say AD curve, reduction in output, reduction in inflation and output relation. So we now connected each of these. Cool.